All right. I guess can't make the watch sit flat, so I'll just have to use.
Don't turn it.
So I'll just have, instead of, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Instead of paying attention to my watch, there's a calendar back there, so not to worry. I often think of, compare myself to my grandfather, who was born in 1870, and he went through, I think, some of the greatest changes, technological changes that any generation's ever been through, from living what was right then the Indian Territory in Oklahoma, right on the border with Arkansas, 20 years before the last battle of what we used to call the Indian Wars. I never heard it called Native American Wars, but you know what I'm talking about. And then to live long enough to see Earth satellites and to fly in airliners and things like that, that kind of technical change. I don't think Mike and I and you all have lived through quite such radical changes in technology, as strange as that may seem with Mike's iPad sitting in front of him. But in terms of social changes and institutional changes in society, I think we'll stand up against just about any generation. And in thinking about what we might say or add here to this situation, just the best thing I could think of to say to you would be to describe, my own personal experiences with all of these different trends that we've all experienced together. Kind of my date with history. It really wasn't a date, we just had coffee. And it didn't lead to anything serious, but it certainly was memorable. Some general background. We're talking here about just about half a century when we're talking about the anti-war protests. We're going back to the early 1960s, and I hate to tell you, but that's been a long, long time ago. The background, everything is oversimplified, but the background is kind of an America united. We didn't have all the different sorts of things, or at least they were hidden. I mean, we had June and Ward Cleaver. June Cleaver was the women's movement, okay? And Ward Cleaver was your normal American who went to work. No one knows exactly what he did, but he came home at night and met his responsibilities. We had, quote, colored people then too, but they generally were in their own schools and their own communities and quite happy as far as we knew there. Maybe that began to change a little bit in the early days. Sammy Davis Jr., entertainers like that. We really didn't have an enormous anti-poverty movement either. I mean, we had the biblical poor who are always with us. We knew that. And we had the Okies, Steinbeck and the Okies. The Okies, I think, had become the Beverly Hillbillies by then, so it was okay. We had Ward Cleaver, and we knew that some of Ward's friends were a little disturbed. They were the organization men, and they felt their lives were not leading to very much. And of course, June Cleaver, and the local version, the typical Vanderbilt co-ed here. And so we had been overall a recent victor in the Great War, the Good War, where it was hard, and particularly in retrospect, to see any other choice that this country had, and we did a smash-up, literally, job of it. My personal history was, my background was, I think, a little different from Mike's, but we ended up exactly the same place because I think we had the same ideas. I was raised in the Midwest, not down here, and I liked Ike. I was a Republican. And those of you who knew me in politics might say, really? Oh, okay. Didn't hear that back then. But, I liked Ike, and now my mother was from Arkansas, and she was horrified, threatening to write me out of the will and all that sort of stuff. But I was a young Republican, moderate Republican. I know you probably don't remember what a moderate Republican is. That beast, the last one died in rural West Tennessee about 3 years ago. But with a kind of a Ron Paul attitude as well, which I still enjoy a lot of what he has to say. And at college, I was a member of the Harvard Young Republicans. So this is the radical that became what you see right now. We had several different trends that were beginning to develop out of this background of fog and miasma. You had the civil rights movement, and I think it's important to talk about that because all of these different movements more or less were tied in together and were involved more or less intimately in the anti-war protests at the same time, I think. There's no point in me trying to repeat that whole history, but you had trends within the civil rights movement from my perspective. You had a long history that some of you may know about of court decisions. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP and their agencies had made a decision, with good reason I think, to try to use the courts to change the system. And they were doing so quite successfully. Going back to the 40s, there were court decisions opening up graduate schools, law schools, other things to minorities in this country. Obviously, it wasn't fantastic time or anything like that, but there was clearly progress being made thanks to Marshall and the other lawyers who were fighting this step by step. And the courts were beginning to retreat from the Plessy versus Ferguson 1890s decision that segregation was perfectly okay. And so you had that happening. But then you got to a point in this period that we're going to be talking about today where that began to split up. You begin to get Stokely Carmichael rather than Martin Luther King. And believe me, if you were a white anti-war person, you got a very different response from Martin Luther King than you did from Stokely Carmichael. And you all remember Stokely. He was quite interesting. You had different groups. You had Martin Luther King's group, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which had one orientation, and you had SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was heavy on the students, a little softer as the years went by on the nonviolence. And then you had those in between, such as, in my opinion, Avon Williams here in Nashville, who had some elements of both, and all heroic, all leading towards major changes. All right, Vietnam itself, that goes back to World War II, as I guess you all know. After World War II, the Japanese in Vietnam surrendered, but they kept the French in jail for another month after the total surrender of Japan. And the Vietnamese took over their own country. Shocking, I know, but it happened. And Ho Chi Minh, according to the history I read, wanted to work with the United States, offered to. We got, you got to remember Winston Churchill, heroic figure there, but very much for the British Empire. Same thing with France. They wanted their empire back. So we ended up transporting their troops back to Vietnam to take Vietnam back from the Vietnamese, to be really blunt. And so that was the beginning of it. The French found at Dien Bien Phu and a few other locations there that this was probably not a very friendly place to be, and they just didn't have what it took to conquer this country again, and so basically they got us involved. And as you know, by the Eisenhower era, we had 900 advisors in Vietnam. By 1963, in spite of allegedly warnings from President Eisenhower as he left office, President Kennedy had 16,000 advisors in Vietnam. Finally, in 1965, March 8th, 1965, we had the first combat troops sent in there, 3,500. It later went to 500,000, and you know the rest is history. It was an interesting period in that most of us started off the way most Americans, if not all Americans, started in every war we get ourselves into or are involved in one way or the other. And that is, we have this instinctive, patriotic, back the country reaction. And I really hope that never goes away. If we ever get to the point where our first reaction is cynicism whenever our country is in a difficult situation, then I think we've lost something very, very important. However, the price of that instant patriotism is that we end up backing wars that we later think were fairly foolish, even tragic in some situation. And this certainly happened here. I mean, it's fun to go back and look at the figures. In March of 1966, almost 60% of people agreed that the Vietnam War was something we should be doing. It was not a mistake. By May of 1966, same year, it had dropped 10 points to 49. It then bounced around for some time between 48 and 51% till October of 67. Again, not much later. It was 44%. In April 68, it was 40%. Then it dropped into the 30s, and finally in the early 70s, 71, it was 28%. But look, this is 1971, and we were in Vietnam with advisors back in 1960, and had 16,000 people there in 1963. So the reaction was obviously fairly slow. So what was the reaction here in this country? Almost paralleling the rise in concern about this and the rise in the number of troops were the rise in the demonstrations. We had, but when I first went to college in '62, it was the era that I spoke of earlier, the last remnant of the 1950s. I mean, the sexiest thing anybody did then was to put medical school alcohol in punch. I mean, that was really the hot thing to do. Boy, that'll give you a headache, by the way. By the time I left in 1966, I had friends come by and say, "Can I use your phone?" Sure. Call up their supplier to get a little marijuana. You know, the change had been that much. It was a time in which the entire fabric and texture of the college life was changing radically. You had the draft back then. You had people who were, every month, 20,000 to 40,000 people were being conscripted, required to get into the military or spend 5 years in the federal penitentiary. So what the response was protest, a growing series of protests. I'm going to stop in a moment, let Mike throw some stuff in here, but some of these things, you know, you had sit-ins, you had burning of the draft card, you had a few cases burning the flag, you had everything beginning to focus on the 1968 presidential election, as you remember. Lyndon Johnson had taken over after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and in many ways, from my perspective at least, had done a fantastic job with social programs, with completing some of the basic legal structures necessary to change racial attitudes in society. Just had literally been an extraordinary president. At the very same time, just a really terrible president when it came to the war. He was a very stubborn gentleman, and he was going to go forward with what he was doing. So many people began to get interested in seeing him out. I mean, there were, you know, the protests, the chants of, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? And then we get to 1968. Gene McCarthy, Senator McCarthy, an unusual individual to say the least, ran for president that year. And that's when I first got into politics, beyond simply, you know, being a young Republican, cheering for Nixon, believe it or not, when he ran the first time, and doing all those kind of strange things. In this situation, I basically got a fundraising letter saying, please give money to McCarthy. I said, all right. So I gave him $25 or whatever was my big money then. But I thought this is something I really needed, a place to send this. We didn't have the internet back then. And so I made up a whole bunch. I took the sociology department mimeograph machine and made up a whole bunch of copies of where you could send your money if you wanted to support McCarthy. We got a bunch of the graduate students there to start handing them out over Vanderbilt campus. The undergraduate student organizations were organizing various kinds of, not exactly teach-ins, but play programs, if you would. And so they invited me to speak for McCarthy because put my name on these things because you had to put your name on it if you're going to distribute it on campus. And so we all got active. Clean for Gene was the idea, that began to progress. We had a number of people in Tennessee working for McCarthy. Certainly not anything like a majority. That was an amazing experience. But the interesting thing was you began to develop a fission, a split between the people who should have been, it seemed to me, working together. The folks who were in the women's movement, the nascent women's movement at that time, the desegregation, black movement, the anti-war movement. All of these folks were, it seems to me, interested in the same sorts of things, but you were beginning to have a fission about it. Let me stop for a moment, let Mike take a few minutes, and then I'll continue with what happened to us here in the movement in Tennessee.
First, let me say, those of you who have known me for a while understand that I sort of do a James Joyce speak in stream of consciousness. And so you all will just have to bear with me and listen, pretend that you're in Ireland and you're hearing me as in an Irish pub or something like that. I thought it was interesting when Steve said he was a Harvard Republican. Strangely enough, I was a Vanderbilt Democrat. There weren't a lot of those at that time either. I was president of the Vanderbilt Young Democrats, which really got me started into politics. Much earlier, I had written a letter to the editor about desegregation when I was in 8th grade, and we wound up having a small cross burned in our front yard. Over here, you can't hear me? See if I can get...
You're on.
I'm on. I'll try to speak up. So at any rate, over close to Woodmont School, we had a small cross burned in the front yard. So my parents had always been socially conscious of these kinds of issues, but here at Vanderbilt, we started out here and we organized over, and you might not believe it, in Tennessee we had college young Democrats on over 40 campuses in the state of Tennessee. That's, given the current state of affairs, that might strike you as somewhat unusual, but we were one of the largest college young Democrats organization in the entire nation. In '64, I was involved with setting up the national campaign for college young Democrats and writing some of the manuals and suggestions on how you organize in college campuses in the Johnson campaign. And as a result, in '65, I wound up being put on the National Board of College Young Democrats. This is where I'm going to sort of digress a little bit and talk about, as you talked about desegregation here. Right through that time, we were here on Vanderbilt, we were talking about the campus grill and integration of the campus grill down here, which is not far away from where we're at now. But that was a big campus issue. And that ties back into John Siegenthaler and the things he did there. And I'm going to wind up going back to John Siegenthaler. He seems to be a unifying thread, and Nashville has played such a big role in a lot of these in a lot of these movements. So at any rate, I wound up being on the National Board of College Young Democrats. I decided in late '65 to invite them for their first ever meeting in the South. They came here. I hate to say this now, but we wound up meeting at Cheekwood, which might not strike you as a really political place, but I was trying to show off Nashville at the time. And in late '65, the National Board of College Young Democrats took a position paper on the Vietnam War that was almost identical to the position we had taken in 1964, which was that it's a war we should support, but that we shouldn't be, it should not be our war. We should be supporting the Vietnamese, and we should not let it become an American war. That we had out there at Cheekwood, we had John Siegenthaler came and spoke, Dick Fulton came and spoke, And we passed that resolution without a lot of debate, because it was mostly a reiteration of the same position we'd taken in '64. About 4 months later, one of the national, Paul Week, who was writing with the New Republic, I think at the time, made a story out of that in the New Republic. And, the position was, it didn't seem that the College Young Democrats' position had changed, that the president's position had changed during those 2 years. As a result, that became a cause célèbre at the national level. We had the New York Times trying to interview people and all sorts of, the Washington Post. It became a big issue. At the time, you had the Democratic National Committee was run mostly by people from Texas who were very, very loyal, as they should have been, to President Johnson. And one night there was a purge of the College Young Democrats at the Democratic National Committee. We were invited to close our offices there. And several people were let go who were there. And this was not something I had expected to be into, some sort of national debate at that time. I simply had done a job of organizing college campuses. At any rate, we had meetings across the United States with people from the administration, people from college campuses, trying to find ways to express our support for one another, but also recognizing the difference in attitude towards the way the war was going. We met in San Francisco under the aegis of the Burton brothers, the two Congressmen Burtons out there. That was the first time ever I had been in a meeting that went for 36 hours straight, where they brought in food. I mean, I'm 21 years old or something at the time. And you've got congressmen shuttling in and out. And it was sort of like, I could use that to maybe imagine how some of Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy was working. The interesting thing is, we then met in Ohio. We had two people trying to, again, do shuttle diplomacy. One of them was the leader of the Young Democrats in Maryland, Steny Hoyer, now congressman, who was representing, I want to be careful how I say, sort of the establishment side. And you had Barney Franks, who had just left the Young Democrats, sort of representing the insurgent side. That's overstating the differences, because I think there was a total agreement of trying to find ways to keep the internals together and on the same page, and at the same time trying to represent the constituency that both sides felt they needed to represent. Interesting, we had a national convention in Boston. We had students from all across the country come. We had Robert Vaughn, the man from Uncle, what was it? He was supposedly the keynote speaker, but we had a young lawyer from Tennessee come up and speak just before him. Might have heard his name, John J. Hooker. And Robert Vaughn refused to go on after him. John J. was at his best. And regardless of the view of his politics, as a speaker, he is egomaniac. As a speaker, he's one of the last of the old Southern orators. He can light a fire, and so it was interesting. We had to sort of move away around our whole convention, because we had to keep Vaughn separate from John Jay and find some extra time in there. Later on, the Democratic National Committee tried to form a separate group of College Young Democrats. They were going to be based in Ohio. And a number of us went there, and again, we papered over most of the differences, agreed to respect each other's views about the war, and at the same time support for the social programs and the political system. And that, you know, that went on and on and on in ways of trying to create that kind of communication. And I think what I'm trying to tell you is that, and Vanderbilt, of course, with our Young Democrats, were right in the middle of that. Nashville was right in the middle of it. And I guess what I'm suggesting is that you can take the big view, but that's often reflected in the local institutions that where the action is really on the ground. And I think that's one thing that's important to remember, that, you know, you can look at it from 30,000 feet, but it still tore people and families apart at the local level, at the family level. Lots of the same sorts of, a lot of Americans have been torn apart over the civil rights movement. You had this on top of it. Some of those wounds were beginning to heal, and that reopened some of the same wounds. They weren't exactly the same, but there was enough similarity where it was another way that our society became less cohesive. And I can't talk much about the presidential campaign. I had, here at Vanderbilt, I had gone through ROTC, and it was my turn to serve. I had decided not to go to law school at that time. I decided to do my military tour then. I was sent to Vietnam, so I saw a good bit of the Vietnam War firsthand. And that ties back again into some of the civil rights movement, because there, the stress of that war, you could see many, even under a very well-trained and disciplined military, you still saw some of the civil rights problems. One night, the USO brought a movie, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Around 3 o'clock that morning, I was company commander. I was called to go down and intervene because we had two groups, and all of them were good soldiers that were very close to being at arms with one another. And I went down there and between them, and you know, it was sad seeing that kind of split, even within a highly trained military unit. We were able to put that fire out that night. Later I met with leaders on both sides, and the company not only held together, we wound up winning awards for being successful in what we were supposed to be doing. But it made me aware of how, without the leadership and the teaching of what you're doing, the transparency of goals, how people who are parts of the same family, the same nation, can be torn apart. And you know, I was successful in getting that company to be a successful company after that. But it just reflected upon, it brought home to me the wounds that were going on here in this country. The other parts I saw was the coarsening of the Vietnamese society, the open prostitution, and it's a beautiful country and a beautiful culture. We did not have a good effect upon their culture. But just as importantly, in terms of what was going to happen in America and was happening, the availability of drugs in Vietnam, I am convinced, led to a lot of the familiarization of many young people. When they came home, they were familiar with drugs from Vietnam, and I'm convinced that that played a major role in some of the drug culture, and I'm not talking about a lid here and there. Some of the
Don't look at me.
some of the harder
Hypothetical.
So I think it had major effects in terms of our country. It was hard for me to explain to some of my younger soldiers. I was an old guy at the time. I was 22, I think. When you see the Vietnamese not drafting their 18-year-olds, and I'm having to explain to an 18-year-old from South Georgia why he's gone half a world away. When we didn't see the same sort of commitment on the part of the South Vietnamese government. But at any rate, so I think when we're talking about civil rights, when we're talking about the protest about Vietnam, the student uprising in all of those movements, the role of the churches, I think they tie. I think there's a cultural approach there that you still see in our country to this very day. Steve, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Talked about change. One of the most monumental memories that I have of that symbolizes the change took place at Vanderbilt. They used to have a thing called the Impact Symposium. I don't know if they still do, but many of you remembered it. In 1968, Stokely Carmichael was invited. That provoked an outrage by the then publisher of the Nashville Banner, Jimmy Stallman, who was also on the Board of Trust, and he wrote a series of turgid, illiterate, frankly, extremist, hostile articles about this, threatening Vanderbilt and everybody. You know, just like a normal politician would talk today, but back then it was kind of shocking. They also invited Strom Thurmond, and I will never forget as long as I live standing in the gym watching Strom Thurmond cite the biblical passage, "Slaves, obey your masters," at the same symposium where Stokely Carmichael was saying other things. That was a moment in time where you could see the radical change that was taking place. I got active in the presidential race. Told you about that earlier. Ended up as state coordinator for McCarthy, which I wasn't exactly leading legions of troops, but we made some enemies that we've kept for many, many years. The interesting thing about having the two of us talk about student protest is that both of us ended up, and very quickly ended up, inside politics. My view on this kind of stuff, I was talking to all my radical friends, is I don't want to be outside in the street protesting. I want to be inside making the decisions. Now, how do we get from where we are right now, a bunch of people holding up signs, to making the decisions? And one way we wanted to do it was to get some delegates for McCarthy at the convention. And of course, Tennessee's delegation had been locked up by Buford Ellington for first Lyndon Johnson, and then he'd switched to Hubert Humphrey very, very early. And we put together a campaign. It's when I first met Al Gore. He helped us. Al Gore, the younger Al Gore, the almost president Al Gore. And you know, we made some progress. We did some things. We decided that maybe one of the weak points would be the Democratic Executive Committee. They were controlling the Democratic Executive Committee, which had been elected 2 years before, had decided to control all of the delegates from Davidson County. And you know, 2 years before, the Vietnam War was not the issue that was in 1967, 68. And we thought this was wrong. We ended up running a slate of candidates against the local Democratic establishment. And that was interesting, very, very interesting. We won a bunch, but we didn't win the majority. But we began to start working with the people. They began to get a little bit adjusted to us. We finished that campaign, I got involved in the Young Democrats that Mike had been leading for some time. Mike then went off to the state legislature, and I worked with the Young Democrats trying to set up Democratic groups in various precincts. The results of those are some of these neighborhood organizations that you see today. They started originally as Davidson County Democratic clubs, trying to make sure that we never again were frozen out totally of all this. What I watched from my perspective being active in politics, and eventually in 1972 running for the state legislature, and that's an interesting story. That's a program in and of itself. I ended up losing by about 2 votes out of 8,000, and we had literally proof from people like Ken Schoen, who was a major stockbroker in town, that a bunch of ballots had been lost. A bunch of paper ballots had been lost. So I may have won by 2, who knows. But you know, I got into that. But as I watched, some of the people I've been working with in the peace movement were furious because they thought somehow you were selling out if you wanted to participate in politics. Remember the word sell out? I haven't heard it much lately, but that was a big thing back then, and it hurt. It made you feel bad. But you know, you had the white radicals beginning to split off, saying, you know, the hell with this. You know, this is dead wrong. You had the black power groups busting up the black liberation movement, the tension between Stokely Carmichael and his type of folks, and Martin Luther King, let alone how Stokely's folks, you know, would not work with the white young peace activists who they thought were spoiled brats. They probably were, but that's irrelevant. You know, you had the white radicalization, you had the women's movement just beginning, and you had the response from, again, Stokely Carmichael, the position in the movement of women is prone, and that sort of lovely kind of comments. You had others who were tuning on, what is it, tune in, turn on, drop out. And I see some smiles out there. All of those kinds of movements were trying to claim that they were the inheritor of the fight for against the Vietnam War and for peace. Where at the same time, Murphy and I were becoming Democratic pals. I mean, we were playing. I guess you could say we were playing in the. We were playing pro, but in the minor leagues. And we thought, you know, this really was the most effective way to do something. Maybe we couldn't, as state legislators or as members of the Young Democrats, stop all of the war at the national level. But next time something like this comes around, we'll be ready for them. In fact, I swore to myself one time. I said, if you ever get in politics and find yourself talked into supporting the draft, quit right then, no matter how you feel, because you have sold out indeed. And you know, I thought that we could really do something, and I think, you know, there's a few things that we have done there that we've left behind. Mike and I both have been very, at least I think I speak for both of us to say we're very grateful to the folks, many of whom are in this room, who supported us and gave us a chance to do that sort of thing. But our fight was to get into the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. If the reason I ended up a Democrat, I guess, is because that's where the action was. That's where the war was being directed by a Democratic president. You know, I suspect I probably would have ended up here pretty quickly anyway because of the direction that the Republican Party has taken since that day. But anyway, that was our experience. It was sad to see the fission. It was sad to see the good folks busting up and fighting with each other. What we learned from this, you know, what I learned is a sense about our political system. Political system works pretty well over the long run so far. We've only been doing it for 250 years. And if you study history at all, you know that is a fairly short period of time, and we can still screw it up if we're not careful. But it works pretty well in the long run. It doesn't work that well in the short run. Lincoln, I believe, has said you can fool some of the people all the time, all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. That's still to be finally determined. You know, that we have 60, 70% of the people, including 71% of people between 21 and 29 in 1965, saying that the Vietnam War was a good idea. I mean, I respect everybody's difference of opinion, but it's quite clear to me that was an idiotic waste of money, treasure, and 58,400 lives, American boys. Not to mention how many hundreds of thousands or millions of Vietnamese and others were killed in this process. It was egoism, and it was the remnant of the empire supporting the British and French Empire. We as people did not react very quickly. And that's normal. We start off being patriotic, and then we begin to wake up and we say, wait a minute, what in the heck are we doing? Now, I think the parallels today are fairly obvious. Another thing that I learned is we somehow are able to pick our allies abroad who are totally incompetent. I mean, remember General Diem, who was the coup leader and president of Vietnam during all this sort of thing, until we had him ousted, we had him killed, literally, because we didn't think he was doing a good job, because he wasn't. How come the Viet Cong could be our allies over there? What was it about those folks that was different from our folks? And I don't think we've learned the lesson. Same thing in Afghanistan. In one sense, I think we started that brilliantly, keeping our heads down, not being there, but all of a sudden the Northern League around Kabul was suddenly taking over Afghanistan and running out the Taliban, who are truly barbarians in my opinion. Why is it they can't get their act together when the Taliban can? What is it about? You know, it's almost like we ought to pick the wrong side just so they'll lose sometimes. That struck me, you know, in our foreign policy, you know, is not very competent. And then we have politicians who are competent enough to rally the troops to back whatever idiotic policy we come up with. We have just got to get smarter. Every time I look at TV ads for politicians, even people I support, I just want to gag. I said, what kind of idiots do they think we are? And the response is, this kind of idiot, because it works. So, lessons from the past. Questions?
Sally?
Both. Two questions in mind, but let's deal with first. The draft probably made a big difference in the response to the Vietnam War as opposed to non-draft and in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some people say, yes, this is the underlying issue. What are your responses to that?
Well, since I'm not going to run anymore, I don't know what Steve said earlier. I disagree with. I believe a draft is a good thing as opposed to a mercenary army. I think it spreads the sacrifices among many people. I think it provides some training and integration that some people might not have. But more importantly, I think you will also get more feedback quicker to national leadership before you take, and from the American people, before you take those young men and women into a war to put their lives at risk. And my third reason for it is we in this country will not spend enough money to prevent our soldiers, men and women, from having to do 5, 6, 7 tours of duty in a combat zone, and that's not fair. To put a soldier in harm's way that many times, it's destructive to them, it's destructive to their family, and I think it's destructive to our society. So I would support a draft.
To me, there was in the draft a danger of feeding the beast. Lyndon Johnson, when he wanted to add more troops to Vietnam, didn't have to worry about whether he could get recruits to come in. He didn't have to sell. All he had to do is, with the stroke of a pen, he could double the number of draftees from 20,000 a month to 40,000 a month. What it does is, remember I told you we're slow to react sometimes. We're patriotic at first, and we ought to be, but sometimes we suspend belief for too long. Remember, I'm talking, this thing ended at about 1973, and I'm talking about 65, 66. That's when you had a draft. as a mechanism for controlling the government, unfortunately, it doesn't work. In fact, it gives them the ability to do things for quite a while without having to in any way involve convincing the people that, yes, not only is it okay to vote for me, but you sign up and go. Now, I respect what Mike says on that one, but I've come to the conclusion that if you add to the fact that being forced to either go to a federal penitentiary or to fight a war that you believe was wrong, absolutely wrong, you know, I tilt in favor of the mechanism that I think could make a president think, you know, if this gets really unpopular, I'm in trouble.
How does that differ from taking the National Guard and activating them,
How does that differ from that?
the draft?
I think you
Because
have.
most of the people in the National Guard were not volunteering for the Army. but-
Correct. They were volunteering for the National Guard in order to avoid the Army and going to Vietnam. The whole situation.
No, I meant then, but I meant now.
Now you have people who are not being forced into it, and so it's in one sense a career choice. And what Mike says about a professional mercenary army is a persistent danger in our society. He's absolutely right about that. But to suddenly throw that out and say, let's draft the young people, you know, all right, folks, if you all for the draft, let's start with 70-year-olds. All right? You're volunteering. Okay, we've got our first volunteer.
Wouldn't it have been better if Senator Humphrey had become president?
Interesting question.
Can you repeat?
The question was, wouldn't it have been better if Senator Humphrey had become president? That's a perfect example of where you end up in this situation, and I look back on it, I don't know what I would do if I could do it again. Hubert Humphrey was a classic, wonderful figure in our American history, the happy warrior. He was a wonderful, I just can't say enough good about him. I refused to vote for him in 1968. And I thought long and hard about it, but he had become vice president under Lyndon Johnson, and Lyndon Johnson was a domineering figure, to say the least. And Hubert Humphrey was in some ways tainted by that. And the notion of Lyndon pulling out and then shifting his support, as he did in Tennessee, totally lock, stock, and barrel to Hubert Humphrey, was something that those of us who've been fighting the Vietnam War had some real difficulty dealing with. It would have been far better had he been elected president. And I wish he had been, but I just couldn't reward him in that situation after what we've been through.
From a technical point of view, he declared his independence about 2 weeks too late. I'm not talking about how I voted or how anybody voted, but the movement was towards Humphrey at the end of the campaign. He was closing twice, but after he did the speech, if he'd done that about 2 weeks earlier, he might have pulled out a victory, and I think the country would have been much better off. But I think it was about 2 weeks too late in terms of the process for that to work down. There were a lot of people who opposed the war who moved towards him in the last 3 and 4 weeks.
I might have been one of those. The other interesting thing is if Bobby Kennedy hadn't been shot. But those were interesting days. I remember going up to Evansville, Indiana to work for McCarthy, and Bobby Kennedy was in town, and so we were right there. And I was from here to you, that close to Bobby Kennedy. There was no real, I mean, he had some, maybe he didn't have any Secret Service, but there was no real security at all. I could have killed him, myself right there. And those days have incredibly changed for the worse, but probably inevitably. But had he not been killed, I think many of us would have come over who were McCarthy, and he was winning the blue-collar factory workers at the same time he was winning the highly educated college professors who were against the war, and that would have been an interesting thing.
There's been a lot of speculation lately about President Kennedy, people who are writing about Kennedy now, that had he not been assassinated, that he was ready to pull out of the war. Do you have any information on that? And it's just sort of the idea that if he had not been killed, we probably wouldn't have gotten as involved in Vietnam as we did under Johnson.
Two things, in preparing for this and reviewing some history on it. The question was, why don't you repeat your question louder? I'd like to hear it.
The question was, if President Kennedy had not been killed, would he have continued to escalate the war or not? Is
Right,
that-
yeah, and there's speculation that he would not have, but of course, there's no way for us to really know that. But some people who've been doing biographies of him recently have come up with that idea, and I just wondered.
They indicated that he had decided to pull 1,000 of the 16,000 advisors out just before he was killed. That's the good side. On the bad side, you know, he was a politician, like all the politicians, and remember, you had that patriotic fervor. You know, the communists were going to take over, the domino effect. If you let them, next thing you know, they'll be in San Francisco. So how far that would have gone, I don't know.
I think people on both sides of that argument project upon President Kennedy's decision-making sort of what they hoped he would do. But I will say this, he refused to double down in Cuba when the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted him to on the Bay of Pigs.
I'm going to belabor Sally's question just a bit because I didn't hear it. Do you feel that with regard to the draft, do you feel that the protests would have been as effective and intense if there hadn't been a draft?
Question was, do I feel that the protests against the war would have been as intense if you hadn't had a draft? Don't know. In my case, for example, there's no difference. The military had turned me down for physical reasons. I've had a ruptured disc in my back all my life, practically. And I literally was turned down in 1966 when they were really beginning to draft people. And so I spent, you know, the next 10 years fighting for those kind of things because of it. You know, if you have as many troops going to a war scene as you had in Vietnam at a time, it's going to involve a lot of society. I think you would have had pretty similar results. It might have been a little slower, but I think you would have had pretty similar results. Remember the figure I cited to you earlier, saying that like 79% of the people 21 to 29 were in favor of the Vietnam War as late as 1965, 66. So I think it would have been the same. I don't. If you're sending 50,000 or 100,000 troops someplace, that's an issue. If you're sending 500,000 troops, as I recall, we got up to, that becomes a real national commitment.
And again, let me just say, I've got 2 children. If they were, and one time my daughter was thinking about when she's going to college, doing ROTC, I did a lot more investigating because she thought she was going to be following my footsteps. I would be paying, if I had either of my children in the military, I would be paying a lot more attention to the military decisions that our leaders make. So that, I mean.
Did one or both of you discuss the 1968 Democratic Convention?
I was there representing McCarthy supporters in Tennessee, had tickets to the floor, and Al Gore didn't have any tickets. They didn't even give, you know, the senator's son a ticket, so I gave him my tickets, and he got to go. So I missed that. I was in the office, the McCarthy office, in the hotel just before the police came in and beat everybody up. I had left when that happened. I also, you've got to keep a sense of humor about all of this sort of stuff. I was also tear gassed when I was up there. The difference was I wasn't out in the street protesting. I was eating dinner with one of the McCarthy staffers, and it was my first 2-wine dinner. It was a lovely, lovely dinner in a fine restaurant, and the tear gas wafted in off the park. So, you know, I said to myself, let them eat cake. But you've got to keep a sense of humor about this stuff. It was a very serious situation. The security was not intense, it was simply brutal. And it was a very disappointing, disappointing situation, but it was also very, very exciting.
I was in Binh Dinh Province, Central Highlands, Vietnam.
2 wines or 1, Mike?
I'll tell you one quick story. Gotta tell you, my whole life, my parents never smoked. I never smoked. I got sent to Vietnam. The first night there was a mortar attack. And my first sergeant gave me a cigar about that big round. And I don't know how long. And I was even somewhat nervous first day in country, hell of a welcome. And so I wound up smoking that cigar. Got back from Vietnam, I quit smoking. I got elected to the legislature. That's a lot like being in Vietnam. You're not always sure who your friends are down there either. And so I managed to quit. It's easy to quit. I've quit hundreds of times. As soon as this session's over, I'm going to try to make another run. But that's how I started smoking.
There was a significant racial disparity in the troops, both in Afghanistan and Vietnam. To what degree has that influenced the civil rights movement at the time?
You talking about back then?
Back then?
Repeat.
The question was, there was significant difference in the racial percentages in the war, and he talked about today and back then, and do you think that affected it? Yeah, I think when I was talking about the fission of the various good guys, if you will, good gals, that didn't stop both the Martin Luther Kings and the Stokely Carmichaels from orating against the war. It was just separate but equal. They did their fighting against the war, we did our fighting against the war, and the twain didn't really sit down and work together that much.
Well, and I was involved with the draft study that Johnson did. I was the director of research. And one of the things that really did bring this to the forefront was realizing that while about 11% of our population was black, 30% of the people who were killed in Vietnam were black. And that really was the draft fair. And the fact is that the draft was not fair because if you were you could get, under most draft boards, you could get, if you went to college, you didn't have to go. And so there were all sorts of, and we did a study. It was never published, but it was very clearly that draft boards operated in different ways, and they tended, in general, to support the people not getting drafted who they knew, friends of their friends who had come to them and said. So I think that my view is that without the draft, it would have been a lot slower getting protests going, and because it was affecting so many people, you got a lot of people stirred up, including people who were influential. You've heard the stories about Iraq. How many of the congressmen's children are in Iraq, and so forth and so on.
Still, the notion of little groups of neighbors sitting around the table deciding you are going to be taken, and you are going to be required against your will and against your principles in many cases, and you're going to be sent to war to kill other people in a misguided war. It has the effect you're talking about, John and Mike, but the price is awfully, awfully high to our liberties.
And I would not defend, the draft boards back then, sort of like picking juries like they used to.
Yeah.
They're not designed to get a jury of your peers. They just don't do that. There's no doubt that if you were to go back to a draft, the lottery system and exemptions, then you'd have to examine a whole lot of things to ensure that it was fair.
There's a lot of talk these days, you know, periodically, from, going back many years, about having national service for all young people. And, you know, that has some appeal. Not, some would be in the military, some would be elsewhere. The German draft, which has just recently been abolished for the first time, has that. We have a young person come to Nashville every year and spend a year unpaid volunteer work at Martha O'Brien Center to fulfill his draft obligations. That sounds good, but once again, remember I told you I had a little Ron Paul in me. Governmental compulsion, that's extraordinarily intrusive. And maybe if we don't have a sure way to put together a huge military machine for a long period of time, that we'll maybe learn to stay out of some of these messes.
Well, who serves when not everybody has to serve? When everybody had to serve in World War II, the draft worked fairly well because nearly everybody had to go. And if you didn't go, well, your neighbors would say, why isn't he going? Because my son's gone.
Right.
And so forth. So I think that, and the fewer people have to go, the harder it is to depend on a draft system. That's why the draft study recommended a lottery system, although nobody really liked it, and the military was very strong against it. They thought it was demeaning to try to make these important decisions by drafting people.
They didn't want to be thought the short straw.
Right.
Someone,
What about the draft doctors? They were changing so literally, and they were because they were opposed to. They went to the draft doctors, we never talked about them, went off to Canada,
right.
and they were changed so badly. They're all doing standing up for their rights to want to fight the war.
She said that we haven't talked about the draft dodgers, the people who went off to Canada who have been tainted so badly by their actions. But there was no question.
No, but we can talk about them.
Okay.
We sometimes have failed to use CO status appropriately, and in many of those, we should have had more opportunities for CO status. Over, back in the back.
What about the Israeli model, national service for male and female, everyone, 2 years? Cobb doesn't like it because it's compulsory.
Yeah.
I think it's a good idea.
They used to say it's a free country. I'd like to keep it that way.
Too many of us are libertarians on that issue.
Not enough in this room. Like I say, remember this though, if you talk your way into having a draft, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure the 70-year-olds go first. We'll work our way down.
It should be the people who are in Congress
Oh, yeah.
and the state legislatures who have to go.
Now, legislature, you've gone from preaching to meddling.
Yes.
Had had a draft during both the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars, would we have gotten out of there faster?
I tend to believe that. I think you can argue either way. The question was, if there had been a draft, would we have been in the Iran and Iraq, or Afghanistan, I'm sorry. Maybe the Iran was a slip of the lip.
Next week, Mike, next week.
I think there would have been more thought given, particularly if you had a lottery system where you had a cross mix of the society in the military. But I mean, all of these are tendencies. There's no particular silver bullet, I don't think. But I would like to have thought that if decision makers had family in the military, they might have been more willing to think a little deeper. But that's my belief.
I think Mike's right, it's tendencies, and you can argue it either way, and there may have, both effects probably do take place. But I'd ask you to take a look at history, not just your logical thoughts about how you'd feel right this very moment. I mean, look back through history, Germany in World War II, all of the historical armies where you've had conscription, it didn't do any good. You just fed the beast. You just put more young men into the sausage maker, ground them up. Look at World War I, things like that. It has an enormous price, which is certain. These other good effects are somewhat theoretical.
You had made a comment about our foreign policy could use a little work. What do you think Kissinger did right, and what did he do wrong?
I really don't know enough. Did you all hear that? What did Kissinger do right, and what did he do wrong? He could use a little speech therapy, perhaps, but I really don't know enough about the details. Interestingly enough, by the way, you all are from Nashville, the area. We have a sister city in Normandy, near the D-Day landings, the city of Caen, France. And the head of the sister city organization over there is a professor who's also a member of the city council and a lawyer, who wrote his dissertation on Henry Kissinger's foreign policy. And he was very, very supportive of Kissinger, and I, of course, was very, very much opposed to Kissinger because of his dalliance with Nixon and extending the war over a longer period of time. But I'm not enough of a scholar to really answer that. Perhaps
and I'm not, that's not one of my areas, but I will say, I thought he was somewhat realistic in some of his assessments. I think he was a little too pessimistic about our country, but I think the opening to China and some of the real politics, as they call it, were a helpful, more objective look at some of the things that were going on in the world. I think, but he shared with Nixon the problem of secrecy, and I think in a democracy, that lack of transparency is a real problem in terms of educating the citizenry. And I think that, and that's him and Nixon both, the absolute fear of transparency and secrecy was a major failing there.
There is a danger with all of the folks like Kissinger who are very, very intelligent and very thoughtful. And that is, they can fall in love with their own thoughts, like we all do, but they're in a position to do something about it. The famous line about Lyndon Johnson going back to Sam Rayburn, his mentor who was Speaker of the House, and saying, Sam, I saw all these wonderful people in the Kennedy cabinet. They're the best and the brightest. And Sam Rayburn is supposed to have said, Lyndon, that's all fine and dandy, but I just wish one of them had run for sheriff once. There's an arrogance, intellectual arrogance among those types of people, which is the big, perhaps second to lack of transparency, the biggest danger.
Yes. Yes, sir.
One thing you didn't mention about the war, I guess everybody was aware of it, but we were really afraid of communism spreading at that time. And we had the CETA treaty, and that all really impacted the decisions that were made. I remember back then, the conversations were always about that. And we were so afraid, we were still afraid of communism. Certainly it wasn't like in the 50s, but afraid of the fact that communism still was our major concern. And that was one of the reasons we went in there. Do you have any comments on that, or do you feel like that impacted it? Or?
Oh yeah, I mean, I said earlier, the domino theory was the argument, the basis for having to do all this sort of thing. The problem is, if you look at it, it's the Henry Kissingers of the world, the folks who think they have this. We've had the neocons in this day and age who have this global view of how they would like to turn the Middle East into a democracy, and they see everything through that light, and you know they're very bright, they can out-talk most of us, and as a result of that sort of worldview, they pick facts that support their point of view and go forward. That same thing happened back then, because if you look at the history of right after World War II, most of our discussions are from 1950 on. And obviously, you know, Stalin and the communists in Russia were a monumental plague on the earth. And their disappearance is one of the great things that's happened in recent years. But at the very same time, Ho Chi Minh wanted to work with us. And I wasn't one of those guys who saying, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, or anything like that. But if you look at the history of it, you can see that if there were legitimate concerns, they were misplaced, at least in that situation at first. I mean, it's also fairly clear that the Viet Cong were the ones that, the local South Vietnamese were the ones that were causing the trouble, at least at first, and the North Vietnamese did not get involved at the very earliest stages of the war, according to what I read. So, yes, everything you're saying is true, but it would have been so much better if our leadership had been a little bit more, how should I say it, a little bit more careful in their thinking.
So we were caught up in that, we were all caught up in that field.
Exactly.
Why the population probably was so much for it in the beginning, our population.
Yes.
And that's important that, again, in terms of educating people, you know, Vietnam has been an enemy of China more often than not over the long history of the world. When they had the French settlers and the North Vietnamese were fighting, Ho Chi Minh invited Truman to play a mediating role, and then we wound up supporting Bo Dai, and I'm not sure I'm saying that right. It's been a while since I've used some of my Vietnamese, who was the puppet emperor under the Japanese, under the Chinese, under the French. I mean, there was very little real nationalist leader that we supported, which we should have, I think. You know, we supported a puppet emperor, and, you know, they were supposed to have had an election over both North and South Vietnam, and we were afraid, according to what I read, that Ho Chi Minh would have won that election because we had no nationalist leader that had significant popularity across the board in South Vietnam. Yes?
We've run out of time.
Oh,
Thank you
okay.
so much.